The bill came due on Tuesday, and for the first time in history, Canada bounced the check. If you were watching the headlines, you might have seen the numbers. You might have seen the panic in Ottawa or the aggressive tweets coming out of Washington. But if you were only looking at the money, you missed the real story. This isn't about debt. This isn't about 2% or 5% of GDP. This is about a foreclosure. I've been tracking the diplomatic signals between the United States and Canada for years, and usually it is boring, predictable, polite noise. Allies shake hands, they sign trade deals, they promise to do better next time. But what I am seeing right now is a complete collapse of that protocol. The politeness is gone, the handshake is gone. What is happening instead is a sovereignty foreclosure. Here is the reality that nobody in the mainstream press is willing to say out loud. Canada cannot afford the military premiums the United States is now demanding. President Trump knows this. The Pentagon knows this. They are demanding a sum of money, 5% of Canada's entire economy, that would bankrupt the Canadian state. They are doing this on purpose because when a debtor cannot pay in cash, the creditor takes payment in assets, and the asset the United States is coming for is the Arctic. We are watching the beginning of a quiet annexation. It doesn't look like tanks rolling across the border. It looks like lawyers, Coast Guard patrols, and new maritime maps. But the result is exactly the same. The map of North America is being redrawn in real time, and the country we thought was America's closest friend is being treated like a distressed property that is up for auction. Let's back up to the moment this shifted. It happened in Davos. The setting was ironic, the global elite gathering to talk about cooperation. But President Trump used the stage to deliver a humiliation that will be studied by historians for decades. He didn't call Canada a partner, he didn't call them a neighbor. He looked at the Canadian delegation and said, Canada lives because of the United States. He told the world that Canada's existence wasn't a right, but a gift, a charity case. He said they should be grateful. That is not the language of an alliance. That is the language of a landlord talking to a tenant who is 3 months late on rent. It signaled the end of the post-World War II partnership and the start of a vassal relationship. The message was clear. You have survived this long because we allowed you to survive. Now, the terms of that survival are changing. Following that speech, the demands escalated. The United States officially rejected Canada's timeline for defense spending. Ottawa promised to hit targets by 2032 or 2035. Washington said no. They demanded 5% of GDP effectively immediately, or the U.S. military would step in to secure the continent themselves. For Canada, hitting 5% is mathematically impossible without gutting their entire social safety net. It would mean the end of their healthcare system, their education funding, and their infrastructure projects. It is a poison pill. Trump knows they cannot swallow it, so why ask for it? Because when the target acts as a trap, you catch the prey. The trap here is simple. By setting an impossible financial standard, the United States creates a justification to intervene. If Canada cannot pay for its own defense, and if Canada cannot patrol its own borders, then the United States argues that Canada is a security risk. A freeloader isn't just annoying. In a world of hypersonic missiles and Russian aggression, a freeloader is a hole in the armor. And great powers do not tolerate holes in their armor. This is where the narrative shifts from economics to territory. Since Canada cannot pay in cash, the Trump administration has signaled it is prepared to take payment in access. And the access they want is the Northwest Passage. For decades, this has been a polite disagreement. Canada draws a line around the waters in the Arctic archipelago and says, these are our internal waters. It's just like the Mississippi River or Lake Ontario. We own it. The United States, along with most of the world, has quietly shaken its head and said, no, that's an international strait. It connects two oceans. Anyone can go through it. In the past, the U.S. didn't push the issue. The ice was thick, the traffic was low, and Canada was a friendly junior partner. We agreed to disagree. We signed treaties that kicked the can down the road. We pretended the problem didn't exist. But the ice is melting. By the 2030s, the Northwest Passage will be open for commercial shipping for months at a time. It cuts thousands of miles off the trip between Europe and Asia. It is the new Suez Canal. It is home to trillions of dollars in untapped oil, gas, and rare earth minerals. And suddenly, the United States is no longer willing to pretend that Canada owns the keys to the gate. I'm looking at new reports coming out of the U.S. Navy and strategic think tanks, and the language has hardened. They are talking about closing the gap. They are dismissing Canadian claims to the water entirely. The U.S. Navy is preparing to treat the Northwest Passage as a security zone under American management. Think about what that actually means. If the U.S. Navy sails an aircraft carrier strike group through the Northwest Passage without asking Canada for permission, and Canada cannot stop them, who owns the water? Sovereignty is not about what is written on a piece of paper. Sovereignty is about physics. It is about who has the ships, who has the guns, and who can enforce the rules. Canada has a handful of aging icebreakers and a navy that is struggling to keep ships in the water. The United States has the most powerful navy in human history. If Canada cannot patrol its own backyard, the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy have signaled they will do it for them. They call it burden sharing. But in geopolitical terms, it is a foreclosure. Once American ships are patrolling those waters, setting the rules of navigation, and inspecting Chinese or Russian vessels passing through, the territory is effectively annexed. Canada might still have the flag on the shore, but the water and the power will belong to Washington. This fits perfectly into a pattern we have seen before. President Trump has revived his interest in Greenland. Remember when everyone laughed at the idea of the U.S. buying Greenland? They aren't laughing anymore. He is linking Greenland and the Canadian Arctic into a single strategic concept. He calls it a single security zone. The logic is ruthless and efficient. He is arguing that the North American Arctic is one continuous front line against Russia and China. He is saying that we cannot afford to have a weak link in the middle. If Denmark can't secure Greenland and Canada can't secure the Northwest Passage, then the United States must secure it all. He is proposing a management takeover of the top of the world, and he has the historical precedent to back it up. This is the part of the story that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We are seeing the revival of War Plan Red. Most people have never heard of this. In the 1920s and 30s, the US military drew up classified plans for a hypothetical war with the British Empire. The battlefield for that war was Canada. The plan wasn't just a sketch, it was detailed. It involved using poison gas, seizing ports, cutting rail lines, and capturing major Canadian cities to force a surrender within days. For almost a century, we treated War Plan Red as a historical curiosity, a weird artifact from a paranoid era. But look at the rhetoric coming out of the White House today. Trump is using the exact same logic that the architects of War Plan Red used in 1930. He is talking about the border as an artificial line. He told the Canadian Prime Minister that the border was drawn with a ruler and that a unified continent was the way it was meant to be. He has posted images of the US flag superimposed over Canada and Greenland. When a superpower starts talking about borders being artificial, you need to pay attention. That is the language of revisionism. That is how maps get changed. The modern version of War Plan Red isn't an invasion with tanks. It doesn't need to be. The modern version is economic strangulation followed by a security takeover. You don't need to bomb a country to conquer it if you control its trade, its defense, and its most strategic territory. The experts I'm reading, people like Thomas Homer Dixon, are sounding the alarm. They are saying that the friendship we assumed was permanent was actually a historical anomaly. Canada has always been vulnerable. It has a tiny population spread out over a massive landmass clustered right next to the border of a giant. For 70 years, the giant was benevolent. Now the giant is hungry. Homer Dixon calls it a recessive cultural gene in the United States, the idea that might makes right. We convinced ourselves that gene was gone. We thought the rules-based international order had suppressed it, but it never left. It was just sleeping. And now it is awake. The pressure is being applied from every angle. Trump isn't just looking at the Arctic. He's looking at the border lawlessness. He's looking at the drug trade. He's creating a narrative that Canada is a failed state that leaks problems into America. He can argue that if Canada can't stop drugs from pouring across the border, the U.S. needs to move the border north. He can argue that if Alberta wants to separate, the U.S. should recognize them. He has endless levers to pull. But the Arctic is the prize. That is where the future is. Let's look at the specific mechanism of how this plays out in the next few years. The equity payment. Canada is currently in a panic. They are trying to train civil servants to use weapons. They are talking about a whole of society defense strategy. They are desperate to show they are serious, but it is too little, too late. You cannot build a navy in a year. You cannot reverse decades of neglect in a single budget cycle. So, when the ice melts next summer and the Russian submarines start probing the gaps in the Canadian sensor net, Who is going to respond? It won't be a Canadian ship. It will be an American nuclear submarine. It will be American drones. And when that happens, the United States will go to Ottawa and say, "We are doing your job for you. Since we are incurring the cost, we will set the rules." They will propose a joint security charter. That sounds nice. It sounds cooperative, but read the fine print. The proposal will effectively make the Canadian Arctic a U.S. protectorate. It will strip Canada of the right to say no to American transit. It will integrate the Canadian North into U.S. Northern Command. It is a soft coup. The tragedy here is that the Canadian government sees it coming and can do nothing to stop it. They are trapped by their own geography and their own history. They spent decades relying on the US for protection, assuming that protection came for free. They didn't realize that the bill was just accumulating interest. Now the foreclosure notice is taped to the door. This changes everything for the global order. If the United States treats its closest ally, its brother, like a vassal state, what does that tell the rest of the world? What does that tell Europe? What does that tell Japan? It tells them that the era of alliances is over. The era of the protector is over. We are entering the era of the landlord. The United States is pivoting to a fortress strategy, Fortress North America. In this strategy, the US needs total control over the continent to face off against China and Eurasia. They view the Arctic not as Canadian land, but as the northern wall of the American fortress. And you don't let a neighbor decide how to build your wall. You build it yourself. This is why the tension feels so different this time. It isn't a trade dispute, it isn't a diplomatic spat, it is an existential realignment. The people in Ottawa are terrified because they realize they have no leverage. If they say no to the US demands, Trump puts 25% tariffs on their economy and Canada collapses within months. If they say yes, they sign away their sovereignty over the North. It is a checkmate. And the silence from the rest of the world is deafening. Nobody is going to save Canada. Europe has its own problems. China is watching with glee, hoping to exploit the cracks. Canada is alone in the cage with the lion. I want you to think about the map again. We grow up thinking those lines are permanent. We think that because a line has been there for 100 years, it will be there for 100 more. But history teaches us the opposite. Maps are fluid. Borders are just agreements, and agreements are only as strong as the power behind them. The line across the 49th parallel, the longest undefended border in the world, is no longer undefended. It is no longer just a line. It is a pressure point. The protection racket has begun, the fee is high, and if you can't pay, they take the house. As we move toward 2030, watch the water, watch the ships. Don't listen to the press conferences where they talk about friendship. Watch where the hulls cut through the ice. When the first American carrier group sails through the Northwest Passage and refuses to fly the Canadian courtesy flag, you will know that the transition is complete. You will know that the true North, strong and free, has become just another sector in the American security grid. The freelance era is over, the rent is due, and the collectors are already waiting at the door.